Hi, everybody. Welcome. We'll let everyone get to their seats. Welcome. Can you guys hear? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I'm Sarah Eisen. I am a host at CNBC, where I host 2 shows every day on the markets and the economy. I'm very excited to be at the Saudi House. I wish we were in Saudi, actually, but this is the next best thing. I had an incredible first trip there in October for FII, and I've been so excited to engage since then. And when we're talking about the right conversation here, we're talking about growth. And not the way we always talk about growth, GDP measures, but the limitations of how we measure growth and whether we need a new system to measure it. GDP, as you guys know, has been the standard, the framework. We hit it on CNBC when it comes out. Presidents measure their performance on it. We look at history and we see how successful a country has been. But now, as economies evolve and they change, we're asking a critical question that the World Economic Forum has been out front on. And I did a panel for them a few months ago on this, which is, do we need something new for the moment to capture things like social equity, environmental sustainability, innovation? None of that is in GDP. So I'm very excited to be here with some esteemed guests who have different perspectives on this. I just want to introduce everyone. His Excellency Mohammed Al-Jadaan, the Minister of Finance in Saudi Arabia. His Excellency Faisal Al-Ibrahim, who is the Minister of Economy and Planning in Saudi Arabia. Michael Spence, Professor Emeritus and Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. And Ricardo Hausmann, the founder and director of the Growth Lab at Harvard. So, Your Excellency Al-Jadaan, if you could just set the stage for us as Finance Minister, how do you use growth metrics in determining economic policy?
Thank you very much. And I think GDP is one element of that, but it is not the only element, particularly when it comes to fiscal policy. Fiscal policy will need to look at a lot of angles and trade-offs, which GDP alone does not really give you. So you'll need to look at things like, disaster preparedness. Are you ready? And that does not really reflect much in GDP. You need to look at human capital. And the development and sustainability of development of human capital. That does not actually reflect so much on GDP. And you need to make sure that you don't fall into the trap of sectors within the economy who are coming to you and saying, if you give us 100 million, we will give you this much GDP. And sometimes it's attractive, it looks nice, but then what is the trade-off? What if I spend it somewhere else? Can we achieve that growth with another resource than money, policy, etc.? So it's quite complex to look at how do you allocate resources to ignite growth. GDP is one, but there are a lot of other metrics that you need to look at.
Before we get into some of the other metrics, Michael, maybe you could just give us a historical perspective on, as the professor, right, in the room, one of them, on how GDP came to this. Is what it goes back to the Industrial Revolution.
Well, yes. Dropping way back, as economies became complex in the Adam Smith sense, specialization and so on, we went for a long time without essentially measuring anything. And then a group of people, Kuznets and others, basically developed something called national income accounting, which is, a very useful way of kind of keeping track of stuff. So we've used that for years. We will continue to use it. But to fast forward to right now, I think we all understand that if you sort of confine yourself to that, you're essentially operating blind with respect to other things. So I would just, if I may, make 2 points. One, if you're a company or an investor and the company hands you the income statement but fails to give you the balance sheet, you'd be outraged. But that's what we do, right? The balance sheet really matters. These are, just as His Excellency said, these assets intangible assets, human capital, the connectivity that Ricardo talks about, how you're integrated into the economy, as well as tangible assets. They're all incredibly important. So if I only leave you with one thing, I think that this one is important. Second, what you measure should depend on what you think the growth model is, right? Because that tells you what matters with respect to what's going on. And the third thing I think is, if you care about the distributional aspects of the growth pattern, some people are being left out, you got to measure it, and it won't show up in GDP. But I believe the search for a single alternative measure is a mistake. That and I think the multidimensional approach is better, and it's context specific. I don't think the right multidimensional measure for the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia is identical to the right measure in Italy, where I work right now, because the history and the context and where you are in the development cycle, it's just different.
But then how do you benchmark who's doing well and who's not?
I would try to avoid doing that.
You just measure it against your own.
Against your own social, economic, and social objectives would be. I'm not trying to setting benchmarking aside, but I think it can be carried too far in this respect.
We like a good competition, Ricardo. So how do you look at the growth issue?
So I think some 40 years ago, people had this conversation about GDP, and it was incomplete, and they got Amartya Sen, who, as my friend Mike Spence is also a Nobel Prize in economics, came up with this idea of the Human Development Index. And he added GDP per capita, something about health, something about education, and averaged it out and so on, and called it the Human Development Index, and the United Nations still publishes it. Now, 40 years later, we have 40 years of data. What happened? Everybody in the world improved on health. Everybody in the world improved on education. And the thing that they did not improve was GDP per capita. So in the end, and that taught me that if you want to think multidimensionally, as Mike said, you need multiple dimensions. Nobody's trying to have a single metric in the blood test. You measure many things in the blood because many things matter. And it's better to have very good measures for each thing that matters and not to try to average them out into something that's not that meaningful, and then to rank them and see, who does better than what. Because in every averaging, there is an implicit trade-off that you're making. For example, Amartya Sen put 1/3, 1/3, 1/3. That's an implicit trade-off. That's kind of like an internal price that you are setting, which may not be the right price for for every context. So I agree with what Mike Spence just said. I think it's we have very different goals in society, and in an open society, we discuss what those goals should be, right? But then we need to be able to track each one of those goals and have a conversation of potential trade-offs, potential win-wins that might appear in the process.
Your Excellency, how do you think about the limitations of the way we measure growth?
You're asking me after listening to three people that I learn from on a regular basis. I don't know what I will add, but maybe one thing I'll try to bring back home with is our transformation is centered around two things: unlocking potential of the economy and the society through really diversifying our economy, not having to rely on oil inflows for our economic activity. And here, the GDP maybe fails to capture long-term economic value, right? If we respond to how GDP is progressing on a quarterly or a yearly basis without keeping an eye on what kind of foundation we're building, what kind of structure we're building for the new economic structure of the kingdom, it may be misleading. The second priority is unlocking human potential, and I think this is what was covered by His Excellency and Ricardo and Michael. And here, if we only look at GDP, not GDP per capita, not human capital development outcomes, and not the details of what we're doing, we might also mislead ourselves into success. The US's GDP, and I'm not just picking on the US, but the US's GDP, because we looked at household income and GDP per capita a few years ago, and looked at benchmarks on how countries' economic performance was detached or attached to household income. And we saw it's a mixed bag. But US GDP grew 270% over a certain period, I think 30-year period, while 80% of households' income remained constant. And that's something that, you don't want to, and maybe that's synonymous with what you said, Ricardo. That's something countries want to avoid. So it's important to use GDP to compare our performance compared to previous, I'd say, periods, and measure our progress or each country's progress on the side, and maybe use GDP and other metrics to understand where one country started and it ended, and learn from these experiences.
So what do you do about that? How do you measure, for instance, the well-being of people? Your example in the U.S. about the gap in income and growth. How do you fix that?
I'm not trying to pick a fight with the economic policy, but
show us the way.
So GDP per capita is one. Human capital development outcomes across the board. We're looking at specifics. So in Saudi, if there's a higher incidence of non-communicable diseases, try to understand why and try to address it and make sure it doesn't become an impediment in front of more productivity. Our productivity numbers, are they going to go up or down, especially as we transition away from sectors we know, as Ricardo says, these sectors we are familiar with, we know how to operate, we want to diversify, naturally it's going to be new to us. Is productivity going to go down? How much is it going to go down? And there are other, of course, closer to GDP, diversification, specifically non-oil exports, what that portfolio looks like, what is it comprised of, how much it relies on government intervention, how much is it relying on private sector dynamism, how competitive it is in external markets, how sustainable it is.
Right. So, Your Excellency, you participate in IMF meetings and World Bank meetings. Is this something that can be introduced there? I know we're not necessarily talking about standardizing all of it, but it does feel like if you want it to be used and adopted more by countries, it makes sense to go that route.
Absolutely. I think we are talking about possibly two different things. One is if you need, like in the IMF, World Bank and other multilateral institutions, to compare how countries are doing, they will need to use, a standardized metric that everybody measures against, but then we just need to be very careful. Whether it is the IMF, the World Bank, and others, they actually have a very serious analytical process when they look at countries. Look at Article 4 consultation for individual countries. GDP is just one small component of how they measure the progress of that country, but they look at all other factors. They also need to look at what ifs. What if we didn't use this? What if we didn't incentivize? What if we didn't spend or use this asset this way? What will happen? But definitely, we need multilateral institutions to set the standards and to do possibly even technical assistance programs with countries, particularly emerging economies, who need a lot of assistance to be able to actually measure and measure correctly, rather than just using one single or even two or three. You need to look at it holistically, and you need to look at it depending on your own economy and the needs of your own economy. I've always said, including to the IMF and the World Bank, if we continue just focusing on your publications and GDP, the Outlook reports on GDP, then we may be actually pushing other countries to do the wrong thing, just focusing on that number, regardless of what the price is. We could bring in cement facilities from around the world into Saudi Arabia that will boost production, but we are going to kill our environment. We could boost oil production today and score for the next few years 10% GDP growth. But how is this going to help us? So you really need to look at this very carefully, and hopefully multilateral institutions will be able to help in bringing about some form of standardization.
Yeah, I mean, it gets back to the short-term, long-term issue, which His Excellency raised. Ricardo, how do you deal with that? It reminds me a little bit of company earnings and how investors have this very short-term view and demand good earnings, maybe at the expense of long-term investment.
Well, even though, I don't know, Tesla is trading at 100 plus times earnings, and Toyota is trading at 9 times earnings because the market is anticipating different futures for these two companies, and we would like something that tells us a little bit about the future. So there are two ways of asking the question of what should we measure. One is in terms of goals, and the other one is in terms of what do I need to do to achieve my goals. So, for example, there are aspects about the economy that we don't necessarily have good metrics for that I spend a lot of time thinking about. There's a very simple one relevant for Saudi. It would be, when you produce oil, you don't really produce oil in some sense. You transport oil. It was down there, and now you put it up here, right? When it was down there, it should have been part of your assets, right? So your reserves are part of your assets. When it's up here, they're still part of your assets. When you sell it, it's no longer part of your assets. So what's the net of that? So for example, if you would calculate, if you gave Saudi Arabia credit for the asset it has underground, and then oil production is liquidating an asset. Okay, so it shouldn't be part of GDP. It's right. And now, if you transform that income that you generated by selling that asset into another asset, then I want to know, is this asset more valuable, less valuable than the one you sold? So that's just in terms of metrics of growth, not in terms of how. I think that if you ask yourself, what do you need to grow? What do you need to produce? Well, you need capital, labor, human capital. If I would say you need fundamentally one thing. You need to know how to produce. You need know-how. That's a fundamental asset in the economy. A country knows how to do what it does. It doesn't know how to do what it doesn't do. And in the process of growth, you learn how to do more things. You learn how to do better things. Where is that asset? How do you measure that asset? For example, we just saw Northvolt. Northvolt is this Swedish company founded by a guy who came out of Tesla, Swedish guy. He knew everything about supply side management in Tesla. He decided, I'm going to make a battery factory. So he convinced Goldman Sachs and Volkswagen to put money in. He convinced a bunch of people to put purchase orders. $50 billion in purchase orders. $15 billion they raised in capital to invest. They bought the best technology from Japan, from Korea, from China, and for their manufacturing. They put it all together in northern Sweden. Supposedly, Sweden always ranks in the top 3 in terms of metrics of human capital and so on. And on top of that, they could bring in people from the EU, from 26 member countries. And they actually brought people in from 100 different countries. They put it all together there. They were supposed to produce 100, and instead of producing 100, they produced 1. They were operating at 1% of installed capacity. They couldn't figure out. They ran out of money, and then went bankrupt. Why? Because they didn't know how to produce batteries, and they couldn't figure it out. I mean, they could bring the Japanese, the Chinese. It operates without flaws in Japan every day, in Korea every day. They could not do it in Sweden. Where is that asset? Where is that asset? Now, we've tried to estimate it for countries. For example, if you know how to do things, maybe when you invest abroad, you invest with your know-how. So you're getting a return for your money you put outside, but also your know-how. That's one reason why in some countries, foreign direct investment has excess returns vis-a-vis other investments. Companies earn more money in their foreign investment because actually they're not counting the fact that they're mobilizing a know-how that other people don't have and other people can't replicate. So actually, if you go look at the world statistics, we think countries export something we call dark matter, which is this implicit asset of knowing how to do things, if they have it, and other countries import this knowledge and they pay for it, so they import this dark matter, and that would mean that you would want to know not just what Saudi Arabia say knows how to do now, but how much their know-how is growing and expanding in terms of being able to be good at more things and more complicated things, and we're trying to generate metrics of that. We call it the index of economic complexity, and we track it and we figure out ways to measure it. But it's essentially an attempt to measure what is it that society knows how to do well.
But to your example, Northworld, is that what it's called? In Sweden?
Yeah.
But what would that have measured? How would you know that they didn't have the know-how?
Well, in the traditional metric, you say
Like
capital. They have the capital. Check. You have the capital. Labor. They have the labor. Oh, with the labor, does it high quality education? Well, the metrics all indicate high quality education in Sweden. Technology, contracted technology. Well, they bought the contracts, they signed, etc., from the top players in the field. The ability, it's like saying, I have an orchestra director, I have a bunch of instruments, and I have the sheet music. I just need to put together an orchestra that knows how to play together. That's the only thing that was missing. And they couldn't put the orchestra to play together, right? Because people need to know exactly their roles and other people's roles. They need to be able to communicate. 7,000 people from 100 countries, they couldn't figure out how to talk to each other. And the thing you need is not an individual who knows. You need teams who know how to do things as teams. That's what they couldn't put together, and if it fails in Sweden, imagine how it must fail in many other places, that the inability to observe that asset.
How do we, it gets into another question, Michael, about measuring innovation and innovation economies. It kind of happens in the stock market, but does it happen in a growth profile?
No, that's part of the problem. So if you go back 25 years and look at a major stock index like the S&P 500, 80% of the value would be intangible assets. Fast forward to today, that 80% is in intangible assets. It's related to and inclusive of what Ricardo's talking about. I'll give you an example. There's only two places right now in the world where you can produce the most advanced semiconductors. 3 and 2 nanometers, and they are Taiwan and South Korea, Samsung and TSMC. Now that's going to change, but that's a perfect example of what Ricardo's talking about. You can produce the capital, you can you can get a hold of ASML's, lithography machines and so on, but there's something else that these teams of engineers learn how to do. And that's I guess I better start reading Ricardo's stuff. It's really hard to measure dark matter, I would say.
I was just going to say, does that mean like they have an A+ in dark matter? How do we say it?
So the way they transmit it is Morris Chang, who's the head of TSMC, came to Arizona to open the American plant. And he stood up and gave a speech, and the content of it was, we're going to take about 100 American engineers to Taiwan for 6 months. And teach them how to do this. And then we'll bring 100, TSMC engineers to Arizona, for another 6 months. And after another 6 months, maybe this Arizona plant will know how to do. It's a body contact sport.
How do you, in your planning and your transition of the economy, how do you increase the know-how in chips production or data centers or everything, that all the countries are trying to chase right now, and how do you measure the progress?
So before I get to that, maybe another example of how we look at the limitations of GDP. When you look at projects, for simplicity, brick and mortar, to follow up on the previous question, brick and mortar projects, we try to isolate between the impact on the economy that's coming from delivering such an asset to the impact on the economy that will be unlocked because you availed this asset at the right cost and with the right. So we discussed several times the quality of growth. Where is growth coming from? Is it sustainable? Is it also mirroring symptoms or mirroring a dynamic in your economy that you want to see more of? Or is it something that's going to rely on heavy government intervention without a clear timeline or time horizon? So we have these discussions, try to isolate between this kind of impact and this kind of impact. On know-how, we're actually talking to Ricardo and his team about how, there's a lot of FDI coming to the kingdom, and it's all about terms and conditions. These terms and conditions can be drafted, can be negotiated in a way that ensures giving more opportunity for knowledge to transfer. And it's not just about the knowledge transfer, it's about building and creating teams, like Ricardo said, that will grow and grow institutional capabilities. Two things that we think are no regrets: building more institutional capabilities in the government, but also in the private sector through incentivizing them. Today we have programs that are incentivizing better human capital practices in the private sector. And they get, support for a certain level of size of companies if they do that. But also creating the space for the private sector to grow more dynamic, more competitive, and more self-reliant. So terms and conditions related to FDI, but also acknowledging that there are some sectors where a lot of knowledge has been accumulated. And you can't put a number on the potential that can come. And I'm copying Ricardo's, we had the debate recently, a few months ago, the potential that come from the knowledge that has accumulated that can be unlocked with the right context, right? This is not something simple, it's complex, and we're looking into it. We have 3 sectors where we feel we have a lot of knowledge accumulation that can be further unlocked: energy, military spend, and healthcare.
The other topic I wanted to bring up is, so we hit innovation and know-how. What about environmental sustainability, Your Excellency? Do you measure your progress on that? And if so, how?
Again, it's not really the growth, it's not GDP, and that matters only. And environmentally, actually, we are very aware and very careful, and actually do measure our progress. And the fiscal policy, I can tell you, one angle is we announced the country net zero ambition by 2060, and we also announced the emission reduction by 2030, I think 274 million ton annually. So how are we going to measure this? One thing I can tell you is reducing our liquid utilization and utilities. And that is really easy to measure. So you focus on actually assigning enough capital to replace liquids with either renewables or gas. So you'll need to look at how much you will be spending on renewables that is clean instead compared to emissions coming from liquids, and then gas is the same, a lot cleaner. But then that requires a lot of investment. And you need to make sure that these investments that you are going to do in the networks for gas, which is very expensive to start with, and the offtake of renewables from the developers, into what are you going to gain out of this environmentally, but also actually monetary-wise, using liquids to manufacture materials or export rather than burn them. These are actually very well measured. I mean, there are technical measures, but financially we actually look at this in terms of how is our environmental goals are going to cost us or actually benefiting us. And by the way, there are certain countries, Saudi one, is actually our environmental goals are making us money. And that is not usual. I mean, there are only few countries like Saudi Arabia who actually subsidize liquids. Now that we are displacing liquids, we can sell them at market price and pay for all the investments that we need to do in climate action. And there are quite a lot of other factors and other metrics that you can actually measure your spend.
Michael, should emissions measurement be factored into the growth picture?
Yes. I mean, to elaborate, I mean, for sure. Because this is one area where you can't do this alone, right? I mean, you know, so you're part of a global effort, and you absolutely need to measure, however you measure the returns on the investment, you have to measure your contribution or lack thereof in relevant ways to this. So I'm unambiguous on that. Right?
So I just want to understand what we're accomplishing here. So you all agree with some sort of multidimensional, country-specific way to look at growth instead of just straight-up GDP, right?
Right.
Sounds like.
Yes.
And we talked about some of the factors. What other factors need to go in that?
Well, let me talk a little bit about the way, you know, the discussion has gone about how to account for emissions and stuff. Essentially, the emissions are an externality. You put a price on carbon. You have to kind of discount how much you emitted in the process of generating your GDP or in the process of consuming whatever you consume. And that discussion is relatively well advanced. A discussion that is much less advanced than I'm pushing, okay, is the following idea, that in order for the world to lower its emissions, the current approach is you focus on lowering your emissions, I focus on lowering my emissions, you focus on lowering your emissions, and hopefully if we all do that, at the end the world would have lowered its emissions. That's one way of looking at it, and this measure of trying to account for the value of the CO2 emitted and discounting that from your income is kind of one way to do it. But there's a different frame of the same problem, and you'd say, look, we need to lower our emissions. For the world to lower its emissions, the world is going to need a lot of stuff that will enable the world to lower its emissions. It will need to electrify everything that can be electrified. It will need to make that electricity in clean ways. It will need to change the way it does its manufacturing. And to do that, it will have to buy a lot of equipment, a lot of cables, a lot of solar panels, a lot of windmills, a lot of batteries, a lot of things. Who's going to make those things? Because if you make those things and you sell them to the world, you enable the world to lower its emissions, right? So, for example, you go to Bolivia. Bolivia emits, I don't know, a pitiful amount of CO2. Bolivia is sitting on top of the largest lithium mine in the world. They have yet to extract the first ton. So, for the global decarbonization, what matters, that Bolivia focus on lowering their emissions or that Bolivia focus on increasing their output of lithium?
Lithium.
Because the more lithium there is, the more batteries there is, the more everybody else can lower its emissions. So I think we should also measure how much do countries contribute to global decarbonization, not just how much they achieve in local decarbonization. And that's one metric that I think we should be able to make progress.
Why don't you go to Bolivia and tell them to utilize that?
That's the plan.
What else should we be met? What about equity, social equity, gender equity, which has been so big and such a change?
I'm going to go back to one
go
thing. Is the Excellency said, I think the biggest mistake we've made both in policy in the developed countries and maybe to some extent in the economics profession is to fail to measure and react to this. So the St. Louis Fed publishes detailed data on household net worth in the United States. So I went and looked at it recently. It's by asset class, real estate, mortgages on the liability side, etc. If you're interested, it's worth it. In 2024, the 50% of the households at the bottom end of the distribution accounted for 3% of the total net worth of the household sector. Now, you don't stop there, but that number doesn't look like a society that's put together in a way that's going to be sustainable socially and politically. So I mean, I don't think we have a neat answer to what precise measurements should we look at, but for sure we have the recommendation, Sarah, that we ought to look at some of them. And when we think they're getting way out of line, then react. And I think if you want a kind of mechanical or, justification for it, even if you don't care, my experience in a wide range of developing countries of the type that, Ricardo's had as well, is if you get enough of this stuff wrong, the kickback effect will destroy the ability to implement the growth strategy in general. So I don't think it's just a nice to have on the side. I think it's actually an
Seems like it depends, though, on the political system of the countries, right?
Does.
Some of them are very short term.
Agreed.
Including the U.S. Like, I can't imagine. I mean, this is, what, a 20-month presidency until the midterms now? Do you think he's going to be doing long-term, I don't know, kind of growth
Hard to know. I mean,
targets that you're thinking of?
no, I think that what I think is going to happen in the United States is that the incoming president and his team are going to, we haven't talked much about this, but it's important to measure inputs and outputs, okay? How are you doing? That's the outputs. Inputs, are you building the asset and other bases that allow for the future growth? That's why I focused on balance sheets. I think that the incoming administration, whether you agree with the details or not, is going to focus on the inputs. Deregulation, turning loose various parts of the economy, negotiating, more practical, concrete relationships with various counterparties, meaning other countries, and so on. I don't mean to be overly optimistic, and I admit there's a lot of uncertainty, but that's where I think they'll focus.
Right. What about the equity question?
So maybe I'll answer this and I'll comment on what Professor Hausman said. I think every country has its own objectives, like we said earlier, and I think whatever you decide to use as a measure to understand what your progress is against that objective should capture that. As far as Saudi goes, opening up socially, empowering people, moving away from, I'd say ineffectively but abundantly supporting people to focusing the support on the segments that need it the most, and then moving towards creating opportunities and enabling and empowering people and households to capture these opportunities is a shift. And we're looking at that. If you look at women empowerment in the kingdom, female labor force participation, it jumped beyond our target. It doubled beyond our 2030 target of 30%. If you look at women in leadership positions in the private sector, 45% of SMEs today are owned or led by women. Women in tech, we have a higher rate than the Silicon Valley, the EU, and the G20 averages. And this is just coming with a lot of growth potential, but a lot of impact on the ground, even in GDP. So for us, it was acknowledged that really activating all idle capacity, quote unquote, but really giving opportunities for all segments of society and supporting them in a way that doesn't take away from the value of capturing the opportunities that are being created, using that capital more effectively towards unlocking more potential, is something that was part of our, I'd say, progress. And we're monitoring it, we're getting more deep around what we need to do. We have a population policy that's really driven towards this. On what Ricardo said, I think very interesting. We talked about this in the past. The kingdom's knowledge that's accumulated in the energy sector, if leveraged properly into energy transition solutions, climate technology, and other solutions that could also offer the kingdom a way to export this effectively at cost competitively to the world that wants to transition, could be something that I'm not going to say it's going to give us a break in terms of our carbon emission targets, but could be something we should think about. And maybe just backtracking a little bit, it's important that we get the energy transition story right this time. I think it'll unlock a lot of potential and minimize the wastage or loss similar to what happened previously.
I mean, Ricardo, I feel like the Oh, by the way, you can type in any questions. I'll take questions if you have the QR code. They'll come up here on the iPad. But the female participation is such a good example of an unlock of future potential growth that is nowhere near measured in any kind of GDP statistics, but is a huge asset, right?
Yeah, I mean, that's why some 15 years ago I collaborated with the World Economic Forum to create the Gender Gap Report. And so we measure gender gaps, right? I want to say about inequalities that the inequalities we measure are the inequalities we think about. So, for example, in the US, what is salient is things like race and gender, right? So that's what's salient. And there's a lot of effort of measuring and then doing something about it. But the truth is that what ended up mattering politically is that a bunch of white men in the Midwest were hit by the China shock. Their cities got into serious trouble. They imploded. They generated all sorts of dislocations of income. And while people were paying attention to gender and race, this was a shock of a different kind that hurt society in a different way. So the discussion about inequalities is amazingly local. I've worked on a bunch of African countries. The issue, say in Ethiopia, the issue of race is not the issue, but the issue of ethnicity might be an important issue. In India, inequalities have a lot to do with land ownership. In Latin America, we are 90% urban. Land ownership is not. It doesn't move the needle. But what moves the needle is other cleavages in society. So that's why kind of like a generalized standard measure of things may not be paying attention to the dimensions in which society is becoming unequal. And I think that we just need to pay more attention to these issues more broadly and be particularly aware of the things we know that we don't know, let alone the ones we don't know that we don't know.
That's your job. Yes. Sorry.
No, you go ahead.
No, go ahead, Professor.
No, I was just going to give an example. So this is unlocking women as entrepreneurs, I imagine. So let's relate it back. So if that is going to turn out to be economically impactful, and I believe it will, it'll show up, down the road in productivity, growth, whatnot. It's not that they're unconnected, right? We're not in different universes. But that one's a good thing to do, but it's also an input. I'll give you a measure that I use. 25 or 30 years ago, you could count on the fingers of one hand the technology ecosystems that were highly productive, right? Fast forward to today, and they're everywhere in the world, right? On every continent. Unicorns, it doesn't matter which measure you use. I view this as one of the most positive kind of global trends. And if I were, this is related to what you just described, if I were paying attention to how we're doing in producing a kind of dynamism that matters, using the best technologies coming, that's what I'd be paying attention to, regardless of which country. I live in Italy. We are way behind in precisely this dimension. And so most of the local discussion is, why is it that there's a ecosystem in Paris and another one in London and several in the Nordic countries and one in Berlin, and we don't have one? And once you start that discussion, then I think you can make some progress. I'm sorry, Your Excellency.
No, that's all. I just wanted to try and refocus this. I'm here really just trying to learn from scholars I respect a lot. And refocusing on this, I think the whole purpose of the discussion is to say, is GDP a good measure of growth? And if yes, then are there things that to watch for? If no, then what would be the right thing? And I think we all agree that GDP is a measure, is a metric, but don't use it alone. And if you look at it as a measure of growth alone, it could be actually devastating and misleading, and it could actually result in a bad outcome at the end. But then we talked about environment. You always need to think about environmental impact when you think about growth in addition to GDP. And we talked about equity. And equity is not the same as environmental impact. The way you deal with environmental impact is totally different than equity. I mean, you could focus on growth using GDP and other metrics, but then watch equity, because equity is not really the business of the private sector. You should not be hindering the private sector growth because it may impact equity. It may distort household income. That is not the business problem. That is the government problem. And the government problem in terms of equity is you will need to, A, make sure that you provide a dignified way for these segments of the society to up their game, reskill them, provide them opportunities and SME support, etc. And for those who are unable, then it is your social safety net that needs to carry them. But don't paralyze businesses. I mean, I thought that is actually very important in this context.
Yep. So in the last few minutes, I'll make it about myself. If we're talking about the kingdom or the United States economy, and we're talking about the size of its GDP and the growth rate, what else? Give me one or two more things I should point to and talk about to try to open up this discussion in a broader way. Anybody?
Okay. I would at least be careful about measuring those things. I mean, the distributional ones. It doesn't really matter which particular measures you use. I would look at balance sheet things. Like, if I told you a country had gross debt, sovereign and other, of 300%, and another one was at 50%, you might think that was an interesting difference if you were a finance minister. So those are two examples, but I guess I'm going to retire here, but looking only at GDP or current flow measures is like driving a car looking in the rearview mirror, because all of that is the result of past, investments, and whatnot. And I just don't think that's a smart way to go into the future. So,
I would emphasize the following idea. You say we've been talking about GDP as a target, and should it be the target? Should it be the goal? And I think goals should be multidimensional, but whatever the target is or the goal is, most governments, most countries don't know how to achieve it. Everybody wants higher growth. They don't know how to get it. So we need metrics and things that can help countries achieve their goals, whatever they be. We can discuss, we want more equity, more environmental sustainability, etc. That's fine in terms of goals. Question is what should we do to achieve them? And there I think we need a lot of metrics to orient where countries pay attention.
We need to pay attention to the growth lab.
I would maybe to add to that, I think Vision 2030 has so many KPIs. We looked at narrowing this down to a dashboard that's focusing on relatively a few. We think we can even focus that more complex indicators that tell us the story we're looking to see. But that's evolving, and it's like a health scan. You look at everything you can to try to interpret a story that you can measure from time to time. But I think it looks at everything. It looks at GDP per capita, non-oil exports, non-government influenced private sector contribution to the impact of government incentives, and so many. And we're debating a lot of these as we go. And it's not simple, it's complex. But as His Excellency said, I think GDP will still be something we look at. We need to complement it with other things to understand what we're looking for. Our colleagues from Bahrain have an amazing data tool that we're trying to emulate as well, that gives them indications on what their economy needs and how it wants to evolve, and we're looking to replicate that as well.
Final word, Mr. Minister.
If there's one thing I would say is, I think in the context of democracies will need to reinvent themselves, to think beyond 1 year, 2 years, into being able actually to look a longer term and being able to make bold decisions that will support growth. Without that, just responding to the earlier point, I would conclude by saying we need quality growth, and we need to be careful how to measure it. And we need to make sure that we don't, even in the GDP, you don't look at the GDP in the past, but the expected GDP in the next 5, 10, and 15 years.
Right.
Final really quick question. Michael, since you keep saying you live in Italy, Europe doesn't have a lot of growth. Are we just looking at it wrong?
Yes. There's a report, just full disclosure, I had a little to do with this report that Mario Draghi produced. There's another one from Enrico Letta, and there's actually a third one, all of which are focused on competitiveness, innovation, dynamism, and so on in Europe. And they were commissioned by the European Commission. So I think there is a reasonable chance that as economic performance declines, especially on the continent now, I'm going to separate the UK for a minute, that there will be some changes that change the trajectory. But at the moment, that would be a wish rather than an outcome.
Just wanted to leave it there since, we're in Switzerland and we picked on the U.S. and the kingdom a lot. Thank you all, Your Excellencies,
Thank you.
professors.
Thank you.
Great discussion.
We take
Picture.
Where are we looking? Okay.
I don't know.
We have silent.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.